Are you here, Larry?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay,
Everything
something happened. It freezed up a second.
good.
Okay, so I'll start again. So Dennis Young here, Primitive Substance, and it's a real privilege to have Larry Fast here today, one of the pioneers of electronic music. And Larry, thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me on.
Sure. So I'd like to start off from the beginning, how you got interested in, synthesizers and doing this kind of music, and from there.
Well, it was just a natural outgrowth. I was, as a little kid, I was fascinated with things electrical and later electronic, starting with light bulbs and things that lit up. I mean, I'm talking really little here, early single digits. And
Wow.
there was always a lot of music around the house. It wasn't a particularly performance oriented, though both my parents played instruments and when they were younger, children and through, say, high school and college. But it wasn't, nobody was a professional musician. But there were a very eclectic collection of music that was always playing from, their pop hits from the 30s, 40s, 50s, Broadway shows, a lot of classical music, and artists that and composers that bridged that gap, like Gershwin. So I was exposed to an awful lot. My mom's parents were also into opera. I wasn't that enthralled with it, but got exposed to
Right.
it, including live performance as a pretty young at a pretty. So what happened though was as time went on and as the electronics got better and there was this kind of convergence of the ability to use electronics to reasonably make music. I mean,
Right.
something that had been going on since the end of the 19th century, but it really started hitting a peak in the 1960s as transistors came in and circuitry became more sophisticated at lower prices and much smaller packages. And computer music was going on in the background, although I was only marginally aware of that. But it just was a perfect fit for me. I also loved hi-fi and recording
Right.
and all of those things. So electronic music is that one place where all those things converge.
Now, how did you get involved with like Yes and Rick Wakeman? That's a fascinating story.
Well, that was an interesting, different way of coming about. It was I knew I wanted to do something in making music. Record industry is a broad catch-all, but
I'm sure.
producer, a recording artist. I was writing, I was composing. That seemed kind of a long shot, but I wanted to have something in the business. And one of the entry points to the record business and to a lesser extent the publishing business and it has been for many many years through radio. So when I
Right.
was in college, college radio was a wonderful conduit because most people involved in college radio are interested in being DJs or they want to build, maybe build a career in the radio side of things.
Right.
And I wasn't really that interested in ending up in the radio business per se, but um, you were interacting all the time with promotion people from the record labels, and
Mm,
you get to know people that are on the inside of the label part. So one
right.
of the things that the labels were doing in reaching out to college radio stations, because there are thousands of them across the country,
I'm sure you're right.
excellent resource, is when they have new bands. Um, that's a really good point where they can pick up airplay and try and stimulate something that's going to go on that maybe will work up the chain into commercial radio and help
I'm
you build
sure.
your hits, whether it was
Right. Right.
a single top 40 kind of thing on AM or whether it was album oriented rock of some sort on FM. And so one of my good buddies, who I'm still good friends with at college radio, we were aware of Yes as a band. My younger brother and I had actually discovered them on a family trip to the United Kingdom in
How
the
about
summer,
that?
summer of 1969. We didn't see them, but we heard them on BBC, and we picked up the first album, and we thought this is a pretty cool band.
Yep.
And we watched them evolve over the next few years, and then in college radio,
Right.
the S album came out, and that one really did start to break through. And then when Fragile was finished being recorded and immediately released. And there was a small scale US tour that
Oh, okay.
did. So my buddy Frank and I think it was him who made the phone call, if I'm remembering correctly, called Atlantic Records promotions department, said, "We're giving this band of yours a lot of airplay. We'd like to conduct an interview."
Oh, wow.
And they
That's
made
something.
all the arrangements for us to get to the show, to backstage passes, meet all
Wow.
the right people. And Rick Wakeman was fairly new in the band. I was already doing electronic music, and I was building some of my own equipment because I was a poor college student. I couldn't afford to go buy the expensive Moog synthesizers.
All
They
right.
were really the cream of the crop, but they were more than my annual tuition. So I wasn't in any
Right.
position to do that. But as a reasonably talented amateur electronic hobbyist, I could copy circuit diagrams out of engineering magazines and read everything I had and put things together. So, interview with Rick Wakeman and the band, got to meet everybody, met Bill Bruford for the first time that night.
Wow.
He was same age as we were, which was, kind of stunning. And there's Rick, he's 2
Oh,
years old.
yeah.
Everybody's very young, and it's all at a very ground level thing at that point. And in talking with Rick, it came up in conversation. Hey, I do this too. I'm not
How
not in
about
a
that?
touring band, but I'm working with electronic music. And we talked about what I built, and he said, "Could you build me one? Could you build me
How
a
about
computer?"
that? Wow.
And he actually had the tour manager peel off in cash money to buy parts and get started on it.
Oh, man. That's
That was
amazing.
in December, and I think I delivered it to him the next summer, about 6 months later, having to get through the semester and all of that. And we struck up a correspondence. We've been friends ever since. So in March, we spent a couple of hours backstage just reminiscing, talking about families.
Wow.
It's
That's fantastic.
he's been a nearly lifelong friend. He's just been he's a terrific guy, extraordinarily talented, and I have to thank him for that kind of fortuitous connection at that point.
I love the Close to the Edge record, one of my favorite prog records. And then even Tales. I know he didn't like doing Tales, but that record is just, in high school and college, I was listening to that nonstop.
Well,
And and Relayer too.
I was going to say it's interesting because Rick had invited me to come to the studio when they were doing Tales for Topographic Oceans. It didn't have, I don't know if it had
Oh,
a full name yet, but I was actually able to get over to England. It wasn't like a paid gig or anything, but he said, "Come on in," and I thought, what a wonderful opportunity to hang out in the studio.
wow.
Yes, for a couple of, and it turned into weeks of being there, and you could see the fractures in the band at that point. That was as much
Mm.
education about the dynamics of the record business and how things work. But it was really wonderful. They were actually a little short staffed at the studio, so Eddie Offord pressed me into service as his assistant from time to
Oh,
time.
wow. One of my favorite engineers.
He was mine too,
Oh, my
uh,
God.
and producer. He had produced so many albums that I thought were really some of the best of that era in the early '70s. And so he was very generous with sharing tips and techniques. And I wasn't a complete neophyte in the studio, but this really refined it at a much higher level. So it
Yeah,
was
that was incredible. And then known for the mini moog, oh, he was like the the sound of the mini moog. A lot of it was Keith Emerson and him during
well,
that period.
they were perhaps the best known. There were a lot of people
Right.
using the instruments in different ways, and I already had formulated in my mind. By then, I had actually splurged and had bought my first Moog products, including what actually is a pretty early mini Moog. I didn't realize it, but
How about
going back,
that?
going back to I thought I was late to the party because it was maybe 18 months after
Mm.
it came out. I thought, oh, everybody's got one in the whole world by now. I'm really, you know, um,
Right, right.
following the pack, but it turns out it was only like the 600th one they'd made. So,
How about that?
and I still
Oh,
got it. It's actually
oh, you
in,
do?
yeah,
Huh?
it's in its case in the room that we're sitting in right now, but it's not out.
Does it still work? It still plays?
It did last time I tried it, but it's been quite a few years. but
Yeah.
it could be restored. There's nothing in the electronics that is so exotic that you couldn't find equivalent parts. Mostly, it's just like old radios and televisions. Any kind of electronic restoration, the older capacitors tend to weaken and lose their capacity to hold a charge properly over time. I've already changed some of them in that.
And now with the internet, you could find parts, right,
Oh well,
fairly easily.
yeah, and they were always easy. I've been involved in electronics manufacturing, so I've got
Oh, okay.
parts suppliers. So that's all there. But there's a really good subset of restoration engineers that are out there that if I didn't want to tackle it myself or I only would have the experience of working on my own there, but some of these guys do this all the time. So they know where the fault points are and they've got drawers full of replacement parts. So they're out there. If I wanted to restore it, I'd moved on to the bigger analog machines from Moog and other manufacturers, and then
Right.
digital fairly early on. So there's not a compelling need to restore it except as a museum piece.
I want to show you a record that really influenced me.
Well,
A
there it is, right?
fantastic, fantastic record. Unbelievable. I mean, just beautifully done, intense. And how long did it take you to record this record? What was involved to record it what, did you do it at home and then at the studio?
Well, yes, sort of both. Studio, let's work backwards. The studio recording was done at House of Music Studios in West Orange, New Jersey. I had done demos at that facility. It was under another name, but over the last 2 years before that. So it started in January of 1975, the actual recording of the album You Held Up. And it was done 16 track because that's all they had at that point. But this was a small studio owned by a husband and wife team. And I'm still friends with the wife who survived her husband.
How
Uh,
about that?
in fact, we had dessert after dinner last week. My wife and I
How
and
about that?
another one of
That's
our
great.
friends who was also on staff at that studio way back when. But it took about 3.5 weeks to record the whole album on multi-track, and then it took another week to mix it. But it wasn't mixed at that studio. It was mixed in New York at a place called Media Sound, which was one of the big New York studios because it was mixed in quad. This was at the end of
Oh, wow.
the first surround sound music era, and House of Music was only capable of mixing in stereo. And Media had one room that could do 4-channel, and so we booked in there and mixed that. Like I said, it took about a week to get through the tracks. It was roughly one a day plus cleanup and housekeeping that went as part of it. And interestingly, another person who's been a friend for pretty much both of our careers, the lowest man on the totem pole in terms of engineering staff at Media was a new hire, guy named Bob Clearmountain, and
Oh,
nobody knew
boy.
how
How about
Clearmountain
that?
was yet. So I was the middle of the night cheap client who wasn't paying full rate to get a
How
deal.
about that?
Or I shouldn't say me, but the record company who had booked it, they were footing the bills at that point. And so they assigned for this overnight session because we went right through midnight till dawn. They assigned the new guy, and it turned out to be what a blessing. He was a very talented engineer with a lot of production chops already developed, and it was good to have uh, another person in the mix other than me and the producer Marty Scott from the record company. And we got to know each other, and then Bob moved on to Power Station. He's now on the West Coast, but we see each other at audio trade shows and stuff, and it's just been wonderful. He's
Now, there wasn't computers used yet, right, on this record?
um, they weren't mini computers. They were or microcomputers were just emerging. In fact, I was reading up
Hmm.
on those the very first ones that were coming out, the Altair and some of these ones that were hobbyist computers. They weren't quite ready for prime time in music creation yet, but there were dedicated digital circuits that
Oh,
were
okay.
used, and that was used on the album for two aspects. One was the sequencing, Oberheim had a digital sequencer that it ultimately created control voltage outputs,
How
but
about that?
all the memory was digital, all the manipulation of changing the resolution of the sequences and so on. It was all done digitally. It was a dedicated box, big box with
Hmm.
orange digital readouts on it, and I think they called it the DS2. I think it was the DS2 model. I'd have to go back and
Oh,
check.
okay.
But they were one of the first ones to market with a digital device like that that could interface with a Moog and also with their own analog instruments.
Right.
And the mixing on the album, there was assistive digital. It wasn't digital sound; it was analog sound, but it was digitally controlled console. So you could the faders moves could be replicated,
Oh,
again,
wow.
stored, um, in some
There's-
cases stored on tape as memory. So there was some capability, although we found that because I had planned the production pretty well, it wasn't necessary to use that much, if at all. I'd have to go back and check 50-year-old
Right,
notes.
right.
But digital was there. I mean, it had been around since the early 1940s in a
Hmm.
meaningful way during World War II. So it existed, and the costs were coming down enough that it was moving into the professional audio and video environment in the 1970s.
Well, you had to have an idea how to do it with all those tracks, and because it's such a fantastic, complex record of all these different sounds, and really very amazingly done.
Well, thanks. That takes it back to what happened before January 1975, and that was that some of these pieces segments of them had been written as early as about 1972 on a
Oh, okay.
20th century composition course still in college. So there were elements that showed up, and then a band that I was playing with for a while. Um, but it production really got serious in the spring and summer of 1974, and
Hmm.
that's when there was a determination that I'd be doing the record contract with Passport Records, and they in their offices, the business offices, did have a 4-track kind of semi-pro
Oh, okay.
recorder. And so at first I would come down to the offices, move all my synthesizers into the conference room and completely disrupt the office
No,
people.
that's funny.
Yeah. And
Oh,
then they just said, "Oh, take it home." So I took it home and I worked on it there and basically mocked up the entire album, track by track, part by part, notated everything. And
wow.
so there's this earlier primitive monophonic, very noisy and kind of crudely produced version of the album, but it
Hmm.
served as a guide so that when I hit the real studio and the clock was running and the dollars were flying out the window,
Right, right.
there was no inefficiency.
Oh,
And
wow. It's
that,
great.
that was more the both the production side and the business side of how to put a record together.
Did the
And so
record sell? Did it sell at all? I mean, did you get
it
sales
sold
from
really
it?
well. It was up in the top 60, 50 on Billboard for a bunch of weeks, and
Oh, wow.
the record world. Yeah, it did surprisingly well for an unknown artist on a smallish label, and it did resonate. So it wouldn't. I didn't tour it because I really couldn't. This is really a studio construction.
Right.
But I did do a lot of radio promotion. All that radio stuff, going back to college, and a little bit of commercial radio I'd done, gave me a real good affinity for that. So the label, rather than underwriting a tour, made sure that I was flying out to Chicago or I was flying out to St. Louis or wherever, and go sit in with the DJs and either pitch them off the air or sit on the show with them. In some cases,
Mm,
say, what would you like to hear on the radio? And I
right.
say,
I
well, I
bet
like
you
this
that.
classical piece, or I like this, or here's one of my favorite Yes pieces. Pay
Now,
little pay.
where was Passport Records located? Was that in New Jersey, the
Um,
label?
yeah, the main office, well, Gem Records, which was the
We're talking.
import people, the distribution wing. They started a label, and they co-owned it with Sire Records, which was
Okay.
fine. and Richard Goddard in New York, and
Okay.
they had a pretty good roster themselves. They had distribution in place in America, but Gem's distribution was also quite good. But they were mostly known for selling imports of UK and European and occasionally Japanese pressings. So they already had the ins and the promotions with to the record stores and somewhat to the radio, but it helped to get an American record, and I was the first American artist on Passport. Um, it helped to get that into the conventional pipeline. So
Oh, okay.
by the time my record came out, the Sire Passport um, uh, group was being distributed through ABC Records. That's ABC, the broadcast network,
Right.
used to have a record division. They
Oh, I didn't know
they
that.
folded that up in the 1970s, but
How
it was
about that?
it was pretty
Oh,
big. I mean, they had Dunhill Records and others, a lot of very big records, the Mamas and the Papas, and a lot of country music in that era was through ABC.
oh, okay.
Somebody up in the front office decided they only wanted to be in the broadcast business, so they got out of the record business.
So you did 8 more records, right? Under Synergy. How many more records did you do with?
Yeah, there were well, there are a total of 9 releases in the catalog, but one is a 2-disc compilation of uh, things that were the most popular tracks and a couple of odds and ends thrown in
Okay.
bonuses. And then the most recent one that was actually done under the Synergy name,
Oh,
which was in
okay.
the early 2000s, was a digital re-record of selected tracks from the earlier albums. So those are done on digital synthesizers or entirely in computers and then recorded digitally.
Oh, wow. I don't have that one. I have to get that one because I have all your records. They're all fantastic.
Thanks. It's called Reconstructed Artifacts. They're
Okay.
all up. They're on all the major streamers at this point. You know, there's not that much physical media out there, although you can find them out there.
Right.
So, but you know, you can go to Spotify or iTunes or Tidal or just about anything.
Well,
There's
I'll put that at the end, to put everything that you want as far as where to find your music. Well, now let's go to another big category, Peter Gabriel.
sure.
And that's an amazing period because I saw you guys live at least 3 or 4 times
Oh,
that
great.
period. It was really fantastic. So how did you meet Peter?
Uh, Through college radio, same thing.
How about that?
Called the label when Genesis was a baby band and they were playing very small gigs and said, got an eye on this band, and we'd like to feature them on our radio air and get an exclusive interview. You know,
How
or
about that?
unique interview, maybe that
Right.
we're interviewing. So it was great. That was they had played their sort of American debut. Um, that was done in December of 1972 at Philharmonic Hall in New York. That was promoted as the first American concert by Genesis, although they were already quite big in the UK and on the continent.
Wow.
And it wasn't actually the first gig. There was a warm-up gig the night before at Brandeis University, but that was sort of, you know, it would for WNEW-FM, who sponsored
Oh,
the
yeah.
Philharmonic
Oh,
Hall
okay.
gig. They wanted to be the first, so it became known as the first. And it was, I was there. It was
That must
fairly,
have been amazing. I would have loved to have seen those gigs.
it was really something. And then within, they only did this real quick hit of, I think, just 2 shows, and then went back to the UK, but then returned in March. So like 12 weeks later, they were back at Princeton University and other places, and that's where we made the arrangements with the record label to meet in a Holiday Inn on Route One, sometime somewhere near Princeton.
How about that? That's
That's where the
something.
interview was done. So got actually spent more time talking with Tony Banks as the keyboard to keyboard thing again.
Oh, he was amazing. A
Yep,
great player.
but the connection with Genesis continued, but in a weird sort of way, because within a year I was already becoming a recording artist. I was already associated with Passport Records and Gem Records, and Gem as an import company was hugely important to making Genesis the success they are.
Oh, wow. I
because
never knew that.
because most of the people that bought Genesis in the early days did not buy it through their American record label. They bought them directly as imported records, brought in British pressings, put on pallets onto air transport, landed at Newark Airport, into
Oh
the
my
Gem
gosh.
warehouse, and out to the 3,000 record stores that were buying them.
Oh,
And
that's
that's
something
how
wrong.
Genesis got known. Things like the Selling England by the Pound promotion that had Peter's head on a
Mm,
fake pound note. Those were
right.
promotion things done by Gem Records, not by Genesis American licensee. They were
Oh,
licensed. They were on the Charisma label in the UK, and the
right.
ones were the ones that Gem was selling, bought directly from Charisma. Um, but they did have a license deal in America, and that allowed another label to press American copies for the American market. But the label was Buddha Records, and
Oh,
Buddha Records
okay.
was known more for bubblegum music and lightweight
That's
pop,
amazing.
and it just wasn't a good fit. I mean, they were an extremely successful label with the stuff that they did, but Genesis didn't quite fit there, and I'm not
Mm,
sure how that deal ever came about, but it meant that the imports that were going out through Gem and Gem's much hipper to that prog market promotion made
mm.
Genesis a very important band. So here I am hanging out as a new artist, but also lending a lot of support within the label group because I know
Right.
about records and stuff. So I was there every time there was I shouldn't say every time, but many of the times that there was
Mm,
interaction between people from Charisma or the management for Genesis, Hit and Run Music, or the band itself. I was just a part of the mix. So Peter knew who I was. He knew my albums. I had two albums out
mm.
at the time he left Genesis, and knew that they had charted well. And he invited me to come work with him on the first album.
Oh,
And,
wow. And that was
and
up in Toronto, right? Bob
yeah, that was
Ezrin?
Bob Ezrin. So yeah, Peter was well, had gotten to know Peter by that point, so that was sort of it was his decision, of course, because it
Of
was his
course.
album, but it was a kind of a not a very portentous thing in a sense because it was like, oh, I have to audition for the great Peter Gabriel. Well, yeah, he
Right.
was Peter Gabriel, but he was also somebody I sort of knew. Bob Ezrin didn't know me from a hole in the wall though, and
No
so
about that.
he was the one who had to be convinced. And it was a mutual friend from the recording studio business that made the introductory call, and everything just went swimmingly. We got along just great, and I talked to Bob far more frequently in the last couple of years than I talked to Peter.
And then there's, Robert Fripp was there, right? Tony
Yep,
Levin.
exactly.
Wow.
I met Tony in the car on the way from the airport in Toronto for the first day of the sessions.
How about that? Yeah, he's a phenomenal bass player. Still
Yes.
playing.
Yeah.
Still doing
Oh,
it.
he's the hardest working man I know out there. I'm a couple years younger than him, and I don't have that kind of energy. I don't
I
know
don't
how
know how he
he
does
does
it. It's just he's got this energy, I guess, to keep touring and touring and touring. It's just phenomenal. Now, what keyboards did you use? What during those first couple records? What were they sequenced uh, sounds? Explain a
Well,
little bit about that.
the sequencers were used, but from the first Synergy album, I mean, it was a pretty easy compliment because there was the Mini Moog, which was at kind of the heart of the sound, but there was an
Right.
Oberheim SEM1, which was another little module that they made, was really a synthesizer in a box. So it added two more
Mm,
oscillators, multi-mode filter. So now the Moog only had a low pass filter. This had high pass, band pass, notch filtering, and low pass. Added a couple more envelope generators, another low frequency oscillator. It really upped the game of the sonic arsenal that when those two were hooked together and working off a single keyboard.
mm.
So it was more than just mini Moog. I don't want to pretend that it was, oh, that one instrument is so wonderful that it can do anything. It does a lot. It's really
No,
good.
I'm sure.
But this really helped that. And then I did have a Mellotron for the first album. That was the only
Oh, okay.
Synergy album that was used on. And that helped because the Moog was only, and the Oberheim were only capable of playing the one note at a time, which means if you want to build a chord, you had to build it up on 3 tracks and then either bounce it down or sacrifice that real estate. There were places where you don't just want a wash of stringy sounds or cello sounds or something like that, and the Mellotron was polyphonic, so you could hold down chords or play multiple notes at the same time, and it's a good sound too. It's a great instrument, but
Oh yeah.
care has to be taken not to turn it into a cliche. So I used it for the first Synergy album, but it never really got used again because things moved so quickly in synthesizer design. It wasn't necessary. It wasn't that it was rejected. It was just there were other ways to do it. So that was the basic sonic complement of the first album. And then in terms of sequencing, there was this Oberheim digital sequencer, which was great. It only was capable of holding a limited number of notes,
Right.
but you could repeat it. It could be synced to tape. Um, Things that may be very complex, it's something that's not keyboard. You couldn't play physically on a keyboard. It just either way faster than humans can do, or it was working extreme ends of the note sonic range. They could be programmed into the sequence and then manually triggered,
Okay.
essentially flying them into the tape. But then they were recorded. The sounds were recorded analog.
Hmm.
Everything was analog, and that's kind of the way it went. I more or less engineered the album myself. House of Music engineers would occasionally help me with the patch bay and figure out where the particular compressor or limiter input was and get patched up for tape delays or something like that. But for the most part, I was on my own. Many nights spent in that cold January alone overnight,
Oh man.
just me and the remote control and 2 cats that lived at the studio.
Now
Yeah.
on those records, did you were able to program the sounds? Because like San Jacinto, Games Without Frontiers, like especially live, how were you able to do that? Was it taped? What were
No, by the when I was doing the first Synergy album, there really wasn't any good way to store the patches, so they were
okay.
set up. Um, some people, I mean, Moog even made like a pad that had a blank um, schematic of the front of the mini Moog with all the knobs and things, and you could, with a pencil or pen, you could just draw in. This knob was pointing in this direction, and this switch was in this position, and that. Um, I didn't find I needed to notate too much of that. I'm sort of sorry I didn't, because
Hmm.
it would just be a nice artifact. But
Right.
generally, I could hear a sound if I listened back on that demo that I had done, and I said, "Okay, here's the sound for this part in this song." And if I heard it, I knew how I got it, so I could just replicate that. And
Oh, okay.
I just knew, well, obviously it's a low pass filter, and it's set at this, and there's this much resonance, and here's what the envelope generator is doing, and just tweak it by ear till I got that sound back. But you couldn't do anything to preserve that other than notating it or just understand what went into making it. But within a very few years, I mean, literally in the next 2 to 3 years, the first marrying of microcomputers, microchips,
Right.
early Intel 80, uh, well, 8008s and then 8080s and Zilog, whatever. Um, Moog was working on a project to which would sense the positions of all the knobs and switches and then
Hmm.
store that as a snapshot in computer memory. They never brought that project to fruition. I've talked in very recent years with a guy named Jim Scott, who was the engineer on that. And very few people knew that project was going on. And I saw his prototype,
How
and
about that?
there
Hmm.
were people that were doubting him that he had done it, and they were doubting me that it existed. And we were able to put our heads together and say, this absolutely existed. It was going to be a sort of a 4 oscillator mini Moog. It had LEDs on it for the first time. There were a lot of things going on, but the corporate powers at Moog, and that wasn't Bob Moog. He was not the decision maker by that time.
Hmm.
Uh, they decided to pursue something else. And so it fell by the wayside, and a very smart young guy named Dave Smith at Sequential Circuits.
Oh, okay.
He picked up the ball and he ran with it. He basically built almost a full mini Moog in a box with memory, and he made it 5-note polyphonic. They called it the Prophet.
Oh, okay. Wow.
And so most of the sounds I could create on the mini Moog, most of the important ones, whether they were on, particularly on the Peter Gabriel albums,
Right.
they could be programmed into the Prophet 5 and
Oh,
recalled during live performance at the push of a button. The original Prophet 5 had 40 memory slots, 40
oh, okay.
snapshots, and they could be radically different. It was like changing, 36 knobs and, 25 switches like
Hmm.
that.
Wow.
You could change them. I got to the point where I was programming in ways where I would have snapshot for verses and choruses and maybe a tag. So a song might take 3 or 4 slots. They soon upped the memory to 120 slots. Moog realized that they needed to get back in the program. They came out with the memory Moog, which did that. And all the other competitors, I was using Moog and sequential primarily, but Roland and Yamaha and all the others jumped right into that same game. So by 1978, all of that quick memory recall stuff was possible.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah.
It was, I just as a little aside, it was even possible to
Sure.
do in the early 70s. There was a very expensive custom system that
Hmm.
Moog Company had designed for Keith Emerson for his shows. So the ELP shows, you would hear rapid repatch changes, you know, between songs,
Hmm.
even inside of a song. But I think it had 6 or 8 memories, and they were very complex, and it was kind of finicky, and there was a tech out on the road at all times. It was not for everybody to use, but it did exist. It was possible.
How about that? Now, how long would it take to do these records? Because I saw the South Bank show on YouTube. I mean, wow, it seemed like it took forever to get the records done, or it was always. Did it take a long time for Peter to finish these records?
Yeah, look at the last one. It was 20 years. The one that came out
Wow.
last year.
Right, that's true.
Um, it got longer. The first one, the Bob Ezrin album, that was like a rocket. All the tracks were recorded within 10 days to 2 weeks.
Mm,
Then he went in for vocals. There were some orchestra overdubs which didn't make to the final record. They were a little too big, and it just didn't fit the character for the most part. So they came off, but they took a little bit of time to record.
right.
But and then it was mixed. It was like banged out pretty quick.
Mm,
Um, Second album, Robert Fripp doesn't like dawdling, so it moved at a fairly rapid rate. But the thing that slows it down is Peter's. Uh, Generally, it's not always. Peter starts with tracks. They're usually pretty, good and pretty interesting right from the start. He's put a lot of thought into that, and he's really good at doing that. So you can have tracks, but it takes him a long time to be happy with what he's writing lyrically, and that
oh,
slows
okay.
it down. So during the early albums, there was a lot of pressure, economic pressure, the tours coming up, whatever. He had to get it done. I have never spoken with him, and it would probably be an interesting essay. Did you let those tracks go before you were ready to let them go, or because I think they're brilliant.
Oh,
I
yeah.
no
They're all
second thoughts,
great.
but maybe he does, and I don't know what his thoughts are on that. So when you get him on the show, you can ask him.
Yeah,
But
I don't know if I'll get him on the show. We'll see.
by the third album, it was getting a little more sophisticated. There was some level of success, and so there was a little more leeway from record labels, management, but not complete. So the third album started kind of late summer of '79. Most of the work was completed by the fall, by say Christmas break,
Mm,
79 into 80. But it wasn't quite done, which was a problem because there was a tour
mm.
that was booked that started right after the first of the year in 1980.
Oh,
And,
okay.
and the album, that was supposed to be to promote the album. The album wasn't done.
Oh, boy.
Not all the lyrics were done. Not all the tracks had been sung.
Oh, man.
So we went out and we did the first leg of the tour playing this new material um, that nobody, for the most part, hadn't heard. They'd heard little snippets of it or little pieces in the previous couple of tours, but um, it was out there, without the album being out. And then I think we finished up in March or April, and I remember we went back in the studio. It was primarily Peter and Steve Lillywhite and Hugh Padgham, and I was tagging along to wrap things up. And they sent me back to the States with the stereo masters. I carried them on the plane.
Oh,
And
wow.
went
Huh.
straight to the mastering studio in New York to get the American pressings ready to go. And that we made that because the next leg was going to be the North American leg of the tour, US and Canada. And the label was, they definitely wanted it out.
No, I'm sure.
We got it done, and it did very well. And it actually produced #1 single. I think the album was #3. You know, it was really Peter's breakthrough.
And that
That point.
song Intruder is incredible. You know, that was really quite a masterpiece. How that drums were done on that. That was
It
just
was.
so brilliant.
Well, that was the kind of thing, and you know, to give Peter a lot of credit, it was sort of an accident the way it happened, and he's
No,
the brilliance in the sound. Not that it was just an accidental setup when Phil was just playing that little pattern in order to test out what the mic levels were,
right.
and and then it was crafted into something that became the heart of that, and then it changed drum sounds for like the next 10, 15 years. You know,
Yeah.
the
I
gated
mean, I
it's
think Phil Collins' record is a solo record. You hear a lot of that drum sound from that Intruder record, I believe.
Sure. Well, it's the same drum kit in the same room with the
How
same
about
engineer
that?
and the same console. And Phil was on the third Gabriel album on a number of tracks. Jerry Murata on others, and they're two of the best drummers that I know.
Right.
Different for different things, but they're both so strong in what they do. And Phil was working on what would become Face Value at home.
Mm, how
Hearing
about
little
that?
bits of what he was writing. He was in the throes of this divorce, and you know, it was really interesting. So the continuity that you're hearing between those two projects is absolutely there. But the gated drum sound, which became this kind of hallmark of the early MTV generation, and
Right.
all that, it was funny. Just a couple of nights ago, my wife and I were watching the Cyndi Lauper documentary. Uh,
Oh, okay.
Let the Canary Sing. It's really good if you haven't seen it. It's
I
great.
gotta see it.
A lot of our friends were involved in that album and making She's So Unusual and what was in there. She's talking about, well, the gated drum sound came in. You can hear it. There's like copies of the Phil Collins, Peter Gabriel drum sound that are used in it. And of course, the production team there on Cindy's album included my friends from the Hooters. So
Oh, how about that?
they were co-writing
Right.
with
Didn't
Cindy.
know that.
So, and we ran into. I was at that point working with Jim Steinman, and we were doing Bonnie Tyler and Air Supply and a lot of other acts. You know, again, this early '80s, early mid '80s kind of thing going on, and everybody was working in the same studios in New York, so we'd all run into each other all the time. So it was very. It was great seeing Cindy reminisce and seeing the studio shots, and there's everybody that I knew.
Now, before we move on, I want to talk about the Fairlight. I
Mhm.
mean, that's an amazing instrument. Now, were you working on it? Were just Peter uh, working on that instrument, or were you also programming it and putting sounds in?
Yeah, well, Peter. Uh, well, it's a weird story. I made sure that it got to England on the Gabriel album. Not that it got to England. There, the story was that right after I did my first album in 1975, Bob Moog had been invited to be on a project for digital synthesis at Bell Labs, you know, here in New
Oh,
Jersey.
okay.
And Bob lived in upstate New York, and this was going to be a couple of nights a week. And I was in the Essex Morris County area at that point. And so for me, it was piece of cake. So he
Hmm.
was thankfully to me, he suggested that I sit in his place on this project. And this was all digital synthesis. It was in Max Matthews' department. And that was my first serious exposure to digital sound, digital synthesis, and capabilities. And of course, coming in at about the highest level you could at the phone company, which
Mm.
was doing these blue sky projects. So we were doing in the various projects, sampling at a much higher level, and then resynthesis, high-end audio, digital audio, which blew away analog recording. Digital controlled synthesizers. There was in
Mm.
one of Max Matthews' room, there was a fairly robust, big Moog modular setup, all controlled by a mainframe computer. And then
Oh,
there was another project where the synthesis was all directly digitally generated. There were
oh,
no
okay.
oscillators. There were software versions of these things, but it was done with fast Fourier transforms and other, the computer math behind what makes sound. And so I had opportunities to work on all of that right through the next couple of years. And in fact, some of the things on one of the later projects, which used some FM synthesis in 1979, that appeared on the Synergy Games album. And those were actually recorded in the labs in Murray Hill, and
Oh,
snuck out because AT&T didn't want anything going out, but
hmm.
I got them out, and
That's great.
now
Yeah, that
there's
was
no
a very
repercussion.
unique instrument, though. I mean, to get those samples and to play the sounds at that time.
Well, here's what happened: is that these were mainframe computers. These were like $1 million machines back then, multi-million-dollar machines now. The one had a hard drive on it, but it had a 7 megabyte hard drive, and it was the size of a refrigerator.
Wow.
So, well, we could see what was coming. Everybody who was, it wasn't only what was coming; it was literally being invented there and other places like Stanford, and you could see the future of electronic music and digital synthesis. And the question was, how soon will it get down into the hands of musicians? Where's the price point? When's it going to shrink so that it's not a room full of computers? And a lot of the projections were, well, here we are in 1976, projecting about this, and the guesses were maybe by 1990, maybe 1995. Then there'll be a home unit that'll be really expensive. Well, Kim Rai and Peter Vogel down in Australia managed to figure out how to convert an office computer with multiprocessors into doing these tasks, and that became the
Hmm.
Fairlight. And it cost as much as a small house, but
Oh, I'm
it
sure.
and it was way scaled down from the capabilities at Bell Labs, but it did the most essential things. So Peter Vogel had a prototype that he was carrying across the United States from Australia, showing at various studios. And I saw it at the power station, one-on-one demo that he gave me.
Hmm.
And I asked him where he was going next. He said, I'm going to England. I'm going to show it at studios there. And I said, here's my number. And it was actually Peter Gabriel's Ashcombe house at the time. I'm going to be there in 3 weeks.
How
Call
about
me.
that?
I know we absolutely want to, Peter will want to see this, because I'd been keeping Peter apprised of what was going on at Bell. So with
Right.
this, I was able to say, we're ready to go. Here's something. Well, not only did it, Peter Vogel, the co-designer, brought it out to the studio. We sent a van to go pick him up, brought him in the studio. We used it the first day.
How
He
about
was
that?
really knew how to operate, but immediately jumped into it, and it stayed with us for a little while. Well, by the end of Peter's very short stay, Peter Vogel's very short stay at Peter Gabriel's Ashcombe house, a deal had been struck for Peter Gabriel Limited, or whatever the corporate entity that
Right.
Peter had at the time, to become the distributor for Europe for the Fairlight.
How
So
about
from that
that?
point
Wow.
forward, we always had a Fairlight. We used it a
Hmm.
bit on the third album, extensively on the fourth album, and then
Hmm.
things moved on from there. There were the that company got up and running. It was called Psycho Systems. It was based in London. Some of what you saw on the South Bank show that was supposed
Right.
to be Peter in the studio was actually staged and recreated after the album was done at the Psycho
Hmm.
um, uh, demo studio, not in the actual recording studio that we had used. Um,
Wow.
and that was an ongoing concern for at least another decade, taking on a lot of different product lines. Very important for the transition to digital or bringing
I'm
digital.
sure it was.
So that was it. So Peter was at the heart of it. I was kind of the catalyst that helped it all happen. If I hadn't literally written down on a little piece of notepaper in my notepad to the co-inventor of the Fairlight where I'd be, he would have gone off and probably gone to other studios and showed it to Tangerine Dream or whoever.
Right.
He was meeting with Seventh Wave at that point,
Oh, okay.
and I don't know where any of that went, but it became very foundational to the Gabriel stuff. And of course, digital moved on way quicker than any of us at Bell Labs had ever thought.
Hmm.
And of course, AT&T was broken up at the end of 1983, and that was the end of all the blue sky art programs over there.
Right.
And
Well,
so things change, they move along, but uh, it all moved so quickly.
it must have been so exciting, those live shows. I saw you guys on Halloween night at Livingston College, and it was amazing. You guys all came in with the drums and Rhythm of the Heat. Oh, it was just fantastic.
I,
Shock the Monkey.
yep, I remember that. I mean, I drive that way to New Brunswick, and I go almost past that building, on a semi-regular basis, and that that was like homecoming for me. It's always the ones that are sort of hometown because technically it was sort of a British band, so
Right, right.
was doing concerts around Bath or doing something in London. But for me, it was the New
That
Jersey.
was one of the greatest shows. I mean, that was such a great idea to come in from the back, all with drums, because at that time, drums and rhythm were a big thing, the
Yep,
big beat.
that
You
was
know,
all Peter. That was his concept for staging, and we'd done the coming in from the back the since the '78 tour, but we didn't use the drums then. That was we had searchlights that we
oh,
would
I remember that because I saw one of those tours.
yeah. So that it was the same concept, but it went from light to sound.
Yeah, well, and the energy on stage was just really phenomenal. So I think we're running out of time. I'd like to do a part two if we could, maybe with, if you have time at some point, the current projects or what, if you want to mention some of the current projects now, you could.
Well, mostly what I've been doing now has been in the historic realm. I'm
Okay.
involved with the Thomas Edison National Historical Park, which has some of the earliest archives of sound, of recorded sound. And the record business basically started there.
Oh, wow.
The first studio was in Building 5 on the Edison R&D campus. It was the first studio in the sense that they just called it the music room, but before you had invented the phonograph, you didn't have anything. You didn't need a studio to record anything because there wasn't anything to record or any way to record. So that's there. And then there's a very terrific archive of the early tinfoil and then later varieties of wax cylinder and everything that came after that, which also includes some of the earliest Columbia records.
Oh,
Columbia was
wow.
one of the first, other than the Edison label, Columbia was one of the first ones in the game, and they're all cylinders too. So it's phenomenal early history, and I'm involved in a lot of that early technology history.
Is that museum open
Yeah,
by
it's
the
a
tower?
yeah, it's on Main Street in West Orange. It's part of the national parks. It's the United States National Park Service.
And there's
Owns
one in Edison too, right? That
it. Well, Edison spent in his career, he spent about 6 or 7 productive years in Menlo Park, which was a
right.
smaller campus. And the phonograph was actually invented there, but then put aside almost immediately after the flurry. And the big invention that came out of there was the electric light,
Oh, right, right.
the electric lighting system. But once they got that up and running, then they moved into New York and stayed there through the early 1880s. And then once that was established, the Edison Electric Lighting Company, and it was moving into really the takeover of electrifying America.
Right.
Then Edison himself, and you've got this one central person, but it's really a pretty big corporation and a lot of research scientists that he surrounded himself with. Really good people they would come from all over, places like MIT, but a big contingent from Princeton and Rutgers or Queens College, the New Jersey-based schools. And they worked in this new facility that was built from the ground up in 1887 in West Orange. It was way bigger than Menlo Park. Menlo Park was just kind of abandoned. It had one central building and a couple little outbuildings. And they're all, well, not all the buildings, but the main central building. And it's a small building. It's only 20 feet by 100 feet long, and wooden building. And that was knocked down and then reconstructed in Michigan at the Henry Ford Museum.
Oh, I've been there. That's an interesting museum.
Yeah, it's very, in today's historical context, it doesn't pass muster the same way, because if you walk outside, then he has the Wright brothers bicycle shop, which he knocked down in Ohio, put on a train and brought it to Michigan. He's got his own first factory. Took a lot of things, took them out of the context where they were developed, and just made his own Disney version of great inventors.
Oh,
but
yeah.
At least they're preserved. I mean, they could have burned down in sight, but but Edison was there roughly from 1873, when it was in New Jersey in Park, till about 1880-ish, and then New York, even though they did keep a skeleton staff on. But then when they built the new facilities, they were really fantastic. Huge machine shops and small. Well, Edison's when he was equipping it, he said, "I want to be able to build anything from a lady's watch to a locomotive."
How about that?
They've got the facilities to do any of those. So the things that were invented there were they continued development on electrical work, but the movies came out of that.
That's true.
Modern X-ray work, which really was spun off. Remember, the General Electric Company is really the Edison companies in not a much later incarnation. Edison left General Electric in 1892.
Okay.
And went on to other things like the movies, which were not a GE product, but things like X-rays became GE Diagnostics as it runs now, imaging. That it's still going. Here it is, 100.
Now, what about some reissues? Are you doing any more reissues of your records?
Yeah, this is like a long-term project, and it's kind of the midpoint, which is why I don't want to get too specific about it now.
That's
but
okay.
Everything that I recorded for the main albums, all the multi-tracks, have all been cleaned, restored, and digitized.
Oh, wow.
They're all archived. They're in a secure cloud location, so we don't have something like what happened at Universal Music, where their warehouses burned down and burned classic albums.
Right.
These are all preserved in multiple locations, and other things, odds and ends, demos, a lot of that kind of stuff has also been digitized. And it's all ready to go, and I'm looking at doing newer mixes in higher fidelity, HD digital, and immersive audio. That's settling down. So the first phase of it really just completed not too long ago, which was getting everything archived and ready to go. And then I keep getting sidetracked into other projects, but the idea is to be able to put these out on everything from vinyl, which is what the original pitch from one of the record distributors was, to high definition surround audio.
And is this going to be on your own label, your own music label?
Well, it'll be the same imprint that I've used, Third Contact Media, which goes back to 1993. But no, it'll be going through one of the it's actually an emerging major label. So it's really talk. The papers aren't signed yet, but there's a lot of discussion going on. And, probably won't be, I'm definitely not the only artist that they're talking to about doing these kind of things, but it's emerging into a big American/European combine for everything from vinyl to digital.
I got to tell you, I got a chance to go to that EME APP site.
Yep.
Oh, was that incredible? Drew gave me a tour of it, and he said, "You're the guy to go to if any questions or need any help. Call Larry."
Oh, he's either too kind or he's pushing off the work because he's very knowledgeable. He's doing a great job there as kind of the day to
Oh,
day.
it was incredible. The amount of keyboards there and it's just phenomenal. It's
It's
cool.
really amazing. It's sort of the dream. There's a father and son team, Vince Papillo Sr. and Vince Papillo Jr., and they are really the backbone of the whole thing. They've made it possible. Extremely knowledgeable and dedicated guys. I can't say enough about what they're doing in preserving. Um, my contribution in some ways is that because I've been so immersed in historic preservation and working with the National Park Service and the archives at
Right.
Edison, I've got a pretty good picture of how the pros do it, and I've been
Hmm.
sharing that knowledge with them about because they're building this from scratch. They've been doing it for
Right.
years, so it's getting quite impressive. But they're working even the museum authorities in Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. They're working with a lot of the doing it the right way, and that's so gratifying to see.
It's amazing to go there, this little town, and it looks just like a warehouse with nothing in it. And then you walk in and it's like, oh my God.
Yeah,
It's like compute every Moog ever made, every model. It's just, especially that part is incredible.
yeah, it's been the analysis too, the circuit analysis from an engineering standpoint of what makes a Moog sound the way it does, and why did the Mini Moog get this reputation? That the modulars, even the same players, nominally the same patch wouldn't sound quite the same. So what's different? And the research has been great. I mean, some of it is just sort of accidental. It wasn't engineered in. It was just different ways of constructing the circuits back in the 70s or the late
Right.
60s. But fascinating stuff.
Oh, I love the Keith Emerson Moog there. But then I heard the last couple of years he didn't even use that. He just had a little rack with all the sounds in it, and it was just basically for show.
Yeah, it was
That was really fascinating.
well the technology from 1970 when that modular system started getting constructed and it grew. If you see the very very early ELP pictures of the last days of the NICE, I think there's some shots, um, and it's a much smaller, like just one section, but it grew.
Right.
But those things were could be a maintenance headache. They
Oh,
were
I'm
they
sure.
didn't travel well. They traveled better than Mellotrons because they weren't overtly mechanical, but finicky electronics. The componentry just got better over the years. Silicon was, when you think about it, that was 1970. So we're talking 23 years after the transistor was, first
Amazing.
made to function. And now
Hmm.
here we are another 50 years out, 50 something.
Right.
It's
Now,
matured a lot.
before I let you go, what do you think of the current trend in music now with all this AI and so easy to make songs now? And what what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think it's a little bit, and maybe looking at the visual arts and photography, there's kind of not only a backlash, but there's also the ability to detect where there's AI. There's also a big intellectual property problem in that when they're going, oh, write me a song in the style of so and so, that means that the AI computers or the whatever kind of generative AI had to go and scoop up all the existing material from a given artist
Right.
and, and basically regurgitates it. Um,
Hmm.
that's using somebody else's intellectual power and then kind of saying, oh, the computer wrote it. Well, no, it didn't. It kind of made a mashup of what somebody else's going from 0 to 60 creativity had created. And so that's a copyright problem. And that's starting to
Right.
get hashed out in the courts and eventually in the law. And so, look, I can see that there's a place for artificial intelligence. And I'm big on using it to do things that people can't do or won't do. And there might be, if a computer AI program was developed that didn't go and listen to every Taylor Swift song and then try and write a cool girls pop ballad.
Right.
If it just came, it didn't listen to anything, and it came up with it. or maybe listened to 2 or 3 things, but came up with something and it didn't sound anything like the source materials, then you could treat that AI as just like, okay, it's another person, but it's got a silicon brain instead.
Right, right.
But that's not what's going on here. This is just mixed tape on
Yep.
steroids, and so I don't have a lot of respect for that. Things like when they're using AI to create proteins for mRNAs that are constructed entirely in the laboratory, that's brilliant, and
Yeah, oh, yeah.
that's where
That's
it
great.
strengthens. And there probably is an analog to that in the arts somewhere. I don't mean analog as in the old synthesis. I mean, there's a parallel that can be done. I just don't think we're there yet. Not to be honest, as smart as the AI computers are, or as quickly as they can think, they're still not. They're not conscious of themselves yet. There'll be a point when that does get hit. It'll be
I
late.
know. That's what's going to be scary when that happens.
Look at Ray Kurzweil's writings on it.
Oh, yeah.
Going on that, so it'll happen, and I don't know if that it's necessarily something to be afraid of either. I think we look at what we've built since we've been using machines, or
That's
stop
true. You're right.
eating horses to death in order to get things done. It's a forward march using technology in good ways mostly, but it can be misused, so that's part of it.
So where can we find your information? I mean, this has been a great interview. We really appreciate it. Just go to your website.
You can go there. It's terribly out of date, and I'm actually working on updating it.
Okay.
Got a year behind on getting that updated, but it's finally beginning to pull together. It's just my schedule stays so busy, both with there was a lot of personal stuff with family over a couple of years when my mom was quite sick, so that
sorry to hear that.
situation for a little while. But I'm not complaining. It's just set my schedule back, and then these other things that I've done, the record industry, since I haven't been touring in quite a few years, and records are only starting now to come back into physical media's return with vinyl, which initially I was skeptical about, but now I'm convinced. So I wasn't doing a lot of other people's records, or an occasional overdub here and there. I'd done something on. There's a new Tony Levin solo album just about coming out, and I had forgotten I had worked on it. It was a couple of years ago.
Okay.
I've been getting emails from people complimenting me, so I guess that kind of stuff. But for the most part, I think the focus is going to be primarily on Synergy's legacy, reissues, and I've got a lot of new ideas. So if there's time, we might be seeing some more things. I just don't. I can tease that, but I don't want to say that that's anything that's on the release schedule at this point.
Okay. Well, this should wrap it up. I really want to thank you, Larry, for coming on. You've been one of my favorite musicians of all time. It's an honor to have you on, and you've been a big influence on so many artists out there. And thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Dennis. And maybe we could do a part 2 when there's
absolutely
some of the reissues maybe are ready to go. That'll give us
when the reissues come out. Let's do another one.
Sounds great.
Okay. Have a great day, and thank you again.
Thank you for inviting me on your show.
Absolutely. Take care, Gary. Thanks again. Bye-bye. See you.